The village lay nestled at the edge of a dense forest, its huts clustered together like wary sheep under the watch of towering trees. From dawn to dusk, the villagers moved cautiously, casting wary glances toward the dark expanse beyond the village boundary, for that forest was not like any ordinary wilderness. Stories had passed from one generation to the next, each retelling growing darker, painting a picture of a beast that prowled among the trees with eyes that glowed like molten gold and claws sharp enough to tear through flesh as easily as leaves. The elders spoke in hushed tones of its immense size, its terrifying roar that could shake the earth, and the way it appeared without warning, often claiming those foolish enough to wander too far from safety. Even the bravest hunters, it was said, returned with trembling hands and eyes wide with terror, muttering about shadowy movements and whispering voices that carried across the wind. The villagers lived in a constant tension, their lives structured around appeasing a threat that might not even be entirely real. Mothers clutched their children tightly as they moved from one hut to another, hurrying home before dusk. Fathers sharpened spears, mended traps and fortified fences, their brows perpetually creased with worry. No one dared venture alone into the forest, and those who tried were warned with trembling hands and frantic shouts to return at once, lest the beast find them. The market square, usually alive with laughter and chatter, now carried an undercurrent of unease, a nervous energy that made every glance toward the treeline feel like a warning. Even the wind seemed alive, carrying whispers that the villagers interpreted as warnings or messages from the beast itself. Superstition ran deep, binding the villagers' lives to a pattern of ritual and fear. At the first sight of a strange shadow or a howl in the night, offerings were hurriedly prepared, small bowls of food, beads and tokens of respect to placate the creature. Some believed that without these sacrifices, the forest would claim someone every month, sometimes a child, sometimes a wandering elder, leaving only a trail of claw marks and despair. Nightly gatherings around fires often featured elders recounting tales of those who had ignored the warnings, only to vanish forever, leaving behind nothing but footprints that ended abruptly in the snow, mud, or fallen leaves. These stories, repeated countless times, became a law of the land, shaping the villagers' lives with fear and obedience, ensuring that even the youngest child learned to honor the forest's unseen master. The elders' voices carried authority, but so did their fear, for they too remembered whispers in the trees and glimmers of movement that defied explanation. It was said that the beast did not strike blindly, it was cunning, patient, and judging each heart. Those who harbored envy, greed, or malice were more likely to draw its attention, and parents often warned their children that misbehavior would attract the creature's wrath. The villagers lived in perpetual caution, not merely out of superstition, but because the forest itself seemed alive, and the unknown lurking within it could be fatal. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping branch, every howl that rolled over the hills reinforced the lesson that the beast was real, and it demanded respect. As fear grew, so too did the pressure to appease it. When unusual events occurred, a sudden blight on crops, a missing goat, or a child's cry echoing through the night, the villagers turned to rituals and offerings. Gatherings were organized, chants recited, and sacrifices made, all in hopes of ensuring the forest's wrath did not descend upon them. Even those who doubted the beast's existence participated, for it was better to honor tradition than risk their lives or the safety of their loved ones. Fear had become a currency, shaping every decision, and no one could escape the invisible chains woven by the beast's legend. By nightfall, the village settled under a heavy quiet, lanterns flickering in the wind, and every ear straining for the faintest sign of the creature in the shadows. And though no one could say with certainty that the beast would appear, all knew that in the dark, anything could be lurking, waiting, and judging. The fear had taken root, a living entity of its own, and it would guide the village's fate until the day someone brave, or foolish, faced the forest alone. Zarya was unlike any other girl in the village. She moved with a quiet confidence, her eyes bright with curiosity and intelligence, always observing, always thinking. Even as a child, she had shown a cleverness that startled the elders, solving problems that had confounded adults and devising ways to help her neighbors with tasks they thought impossible. Her kindness was equally remarkable. She tended to the sick, comforted frightened children, and spoke gently to those the villagers had cast aside. Her presence brought a calm to the village square, a subtle warmth that made people trust her, even when fear had tightened its grip on their hearts. Yet, when the council of elders announced that Zarya had been chosen to marry the beast, a chill swept through her. Her initial terror was immediate and overwhelming. Her heart pounded as she tried to imagine a life beside a creature spoken of in hushed whispers and feared across the forest. The stories of glowing eyes, clawed hands, and monstrous roars surged through her mind, each tale a reminder of the danger that awaited. She could feel the weight of the village's eyes upon her, the mixture of pity, dread, and resignation pressing down as if she were carrying their collective fear on her shoulders. Despite the terror that threatened to paralyze her, Zarya refused to let it conquer her entirely. She drew a deep breath, steadying herself, and reminded herself that courage was not the absence of fear, but the strength to move forward in spite of it. She thought of her family, of her people, and of the countless generations who had lived under the shadow of the beast. She was not merely chosen for herself, she was chosen as a shield, a bridge between the villagers and the unknown. Her clever mind began racing, imagining strategies, ways to survive, and perhaps even ways to understand the creature that had haunted their fears for so long. Her courage shone through in small actions first. She packed her belongings with care, choosing items that might aid her in the forest or in the beast's lair. She comforted her younger siblings with a calmness she did not fully feel, assuring them that she would return safely, even though doubt gnawed at her resolve. As she stepped toward the forest's edge, where the shadow of the beast was said to lurk, her mind balanced fear with determination. Every snap of a branch beneath her feet, every whisper of wind through the trees seemed to echo the warnings of the elders, yet she pressed onward, her spirit unwavering. Even in her dread, Zarya's heart remained open and kind. She thought of the beast not as a mindless monster, but as a being that might possess understanding, perhaps even pain. She resolved to meet it not with hatred or vengeance, but with curiosity and empathy. Her bravery was not just physical, it was moral and emotional, a readiness to face the unknown with intellect, courage, and a willingness to seek truth beyond fear. As the villagers' chants faded behind her and the forest's shadow grew around her, Zarya's fear mingled with a growing resolve. She was frightened, yes, but she was not defeated. In that moment, walking toward the lair of the feared beast, Zarya became more than a girl chosen by fate. She became a force of courage, a mind sharp and heart open, ready to meet the darkness with all the strength she possessed. The morning began with a heavy, oppressive quiet, broken only by the hurried footsteps of villagers and the low murmurs of the council. Zarya was woken before sunrise, her dreams of safety shattered by the reality of the day ahead. The elders had decreed it. The beast demanded a bride and she had been chosen. She trembled as they bundled her into the center of the village square, the weight of their hands and their fearful gazes pressing her down. Her protests were ignored, dismissed as the wild panic of a girl who could not comprehend the consequences of her duty. Each step toward the forest's edge felt like being carried deeper into a nightmare, the familiar fields and paths dissolving behind her into shadowed wilderness. Fear gnawed at her like a living thing. The stories she had been told since childhood surged into her mind with terrifying clarity. The glowing eyes in the darkness, the monstrous claws, the roar that could shatter bones. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, to escape back to the village that had already condemned her to this fate. But as she looked at the faces of the villagers, some averted, some pitying, others cold with expectation, her options dwindled. There was no running, no hiding. The forest loomed ahead like a gaping maw, dark and infinite, and she had been pushed to its edge. Anger soon followed fear. Anger at the villagers who had raised her in stories of obedience, yet offered her no protection. Anger at the elders who had decided her fate without so much as asking her to speak. And anger at the cruel irony that she, who had spent her life helping others, was now being sacrificed to a being they all claimed to fear. Her hands clenched into fists, her heart pounding against her ribcage with the rhythm of a storm. She wanted to scream, to lash out, to defy them, but the council's authority and the weight of superstition kept her voice trapped in her throat. Hopelessness settled over her next, a cold, suffocating blanket. She tried to imagine what awaited her, and the possibilities were unbearable. Would she be torn apart? Consumed by the beast? Or worse, left to linger in terror, a prisoner of a creature whose power had been magnified by their own fear? The lair, hidden deep in the forest, seemed to stretch endlessly, a place where light and hope could not reach. With every step, the shadows grew taller, the trees closer, and the wind carried whispers that seemed almost alive, warning her that the world she knew had ended. And then she saw it, a dark silhouette emerging from the depths of the lair, massive and hulking, its eyes reflecting the dim sunlight like molten gold. Zarya froze, her breath catching in her throat. The creature's presence was overwhelming, an aura of power and menace that made the forest itself feel alive, bending to its will. Yet beneath that terror, a flicker of curiosity emerged. She studied it closely, noting movements that were almost human, gestures that hinted at intelligence. a rhythm in its steps that was strangely familiar. Even in her fear, anger, and hopelessness, Zarya could not turn away. She took a trembling step forward, clutching the folds of her garments, knowing that whatever awaited her in the beast's lair would test every ounce of courage, wit, and heart she possessed. Today she would meet the unknown. Today she would face the creature that had haunted her village for generations. And though her body shook and her spirit quaked, a small, stubborn spark inside refused to die. She would survive, somehow, or she would confront the darkness with every strength she had been given. The path to the lair twisted deeper into the forest, each step taking Zarya further from the village and closer to the unknown. The trees grew denser, their branches intertwining overhead to form a natural cathedral of shadow, filtering the sunlight into shards of gold and green. The air grew colder, carrying a damp, earthy scent mixed with something faintly metallic, as if the forest itself were warning her of the power she approached. Sounds seemed amplified in this strange place. The crack of a twig, the rustle of leaves, even her own heartbeat echoed unnaturally, as if the lair were attuned to every movement she made. When Zarya finally glimpsed the lair, her breath caught. It was carved into the side of a jagged cliff, partially hidden by cascading vines and moss, with stones that glimmered faintly as though dusted with frost despite the warmth of the sun. The entrance was wide and dark, a gaping mouth of shadow that exuded an almost magnetic pull, drawing her closer even as dread gripped her chest. Smoke or mist swirled gently around the mouth, curling like ghostly fingers, and the faint glow of phosphorescent crystals embedded in the walls cast shifting patterns that made the entire place feel alive. She felt the hairs on her arms rise. The lair was no ordinary cave, it was ancient, magical, and alive in a way that made her skin prickle. Stepping inside, the air grew cooler, and the faint light of the crystals revealed vast chambers stretching beyond her vision. Stalactites hung like jagged teeth from the ceiling, and subterranean streams whispered secrets as they wound through the caverns. Shadows clung to the corners, moving with subtle intent, and Zarya felt the weight of the lair pressing down on her. Not just stone and earth, but something sentient, watching. Strange symbols, carved with precision and care, lined the walls, their meanings unknown but imbued with a potent energy that resonated deep in her bones. Every step she took seemed to echo in multiple directions, and she realized that the lair itself was a trap for the senses, confusing and commanding attention with equal mastery. Then she saw him. The beast emerged from the shadows and Zarya froze. He was taller than any man she had ever seen, broad-shouldered and powerful, his fur dark as the forest night and tipped with silver streaks that shimmered in the crystalline light. His eyes burned like molten amber, intelligent and piercing, scanning her as though weighing every thought and intention in her mind. Massive claws gripped the stone floor, yet his movements were surprisingly fluid, almost graceful, and his presence filled the chamber in a way that made the air itself feel charged. There was danger in every line of his form, but also a strange nobility, a magnetism that made her heart race with fear and fascination at the same time. An aura surrounded him, a palpable energy that seemed to ripple through the lair itself. The shadows bent toward him, the mist curled protectively around his form, and the faint glow of the crystals brightened as though acknowledging his presence. Zarya sensed that he was more than a beast. He was a force of nature, a guardian of secrets and power, and yet, beneath the menace, there was a quiet patience, a careful observation that suggested intelligence and even restraint. Her fear did not dissipate, but curiosity sparked within her, mingling with awe. This creature was unlike any tale she had ever heard, and as he regarded her with those molten eyes, Zarya realized that the lair, the forest, and the beast itself were bound together in a mystery far deeper than any superstition or legend her village had fed her. The first night in the beast's lair was a labyrinth of shadow and unease. Zarya curled herself into a corner of the cavern, clutching her shawl tightly around her shoulders as if its thin threads could shield her from the unknown. The cold air seeped into her bones, a chill that was not entirely from the stone beneath her. Outside, the forest whispered through the mouth of the cave, carrying faint murmurs that sounded like voices, though she knew no one could be there. The flickering light from the phosphorescent crystals cast long, dancing shadows along the walls, twisting the familiar into shapes both menacing and incomprehensible. Every shadow seemed alive, every movement amplified, feeding her fear until it became a living presence pressing against her. At first she did not dare look at him. The beast had retreated to the deeper recesses of the lair after her arrival, his massive form curling like a shadow in the dim light. She could hear the faint rustle of his movements, the soft scrape of claws against stone, and the low rumble of his breathing. The villager's story surged in her mind, the monstrous eyes, the razor claws, the destructive power of his rage. Every instinct screamed to flee, to hide, to vanish into the darkness and never return. Her heart pounded so violently she thought it might betray her to him, each beat a loud drum echoing through the cavern. Sleep eluded her. She lay awake, listening, imagining the worst. At times, she could have sworn she saw his eyes glowing like molten gold in the shadowed corners, following her every tremble, her every whispered thought. The fear was suffocating, a weight pressing upon her chest that made it difficult to breathe. Even her sharp mind, so clever and quick in the village, seemed dulled by the cavern's oppressive atmosphere. Doubt gnawed at her. Was she truly brave, or merely foolish to step into the lair of a creature she had been taught to fear? Yet, amidst the terror, there were small, inexplicable signs that caused her to pause. As she shivered in the corner, the beast's massive head tilted slightly, his ears twitching in her direction. He did not advance, he did not growl. Instead, he seemed to watch her with a quiet attention, a patience that unsettled her even as it reassured her. The low rumble of his breath carried a rhythm that oddly was calming, almost like a lullaby buried deep beneath layers of legend and fear. She dared a tentative glance, and their eyes met. Those molten amber eyes, so fierce in their gaze, softened just enough that she caught a fleeting hint of intelligence, of awareness, and even something that resembled empathy. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, but she was too fearful to move. She wondered if a wrong step would provoke him, if the slightest sound might trigger the monstrous side of his nature. Yet, when she quietly reached for the small bundle of bread and fruit she had brought, the beast shifted in his corner, moving closer, not threateningly but as if granting her space, acknowledging her presence without intrusion. The gesture was subtle, but it ignited the first spark of something she had not expected: curiosity. Perhaps the stories were exaggerated. Perhaps the villager's fear had painted him in colors far darker than reality. The hours stretched endlessly. Zarya found herself speaking softly, more to steady her own mind than to address him. "I am not your enemy," she whispered, the words trembling from her lips. The beast responded with a soft, almost imperceptible grunt, a sound that felt less like a warning and more like acknowledgement. She shivered at the intimacy of the gesture, at the realization that she was not entirely alone, that perhaps the creature in the legends was capable of gentleness. When hunger forced her to move, she noticed small things that unsettled her in a different way: delicate carvings etched into the stone floor, patterns of flowers and symbols that suggested care and artistry, remnants of food neatly placed at the edge of a stone slab, as if the beast respected boundaries and order. Even the way he moved, though massive and imposing, was deliberate, careful, as though he understood the fragility of the smaller, human life in the cavern. Loneliness pressed down on her with relentless force. The villagers were gone, their fear and superstition leaving her utterly isolated. Yet even in that solitude, a strange sense of awe began to replace some of the dread. The creature she had been taught to hate, to fear, to despise, was not entirely the monster of legend. There were layers to him, subtle hints of a mind that thought and felt, and gestures that betrayed a capacity for gentleness and restraint. As the night wore on, Zarya curled herself tighter but began to feel a tentative thread of connection. Perhaps survival did not require brute force alone. Perhaps courage and observation, empathy and intelligence, might yield a different kind of understanding. And so, in the first night of terror, fear mingled with curiosity, loneliness with tentative trust, and Zarya realized that the story she had been told might not be the whole truth. Somewhere in the shadows of the lair, behind the fearsome visage, lay something waiting to be discovered, something that might change everything she had ever believed. As the days passed in the cavern, Zarya's fear slowly transformed into cautious curiosity. The initial terror that had gripped her heart began to ebb, replaced by a determination to understand the creature before her. One afternoon, as shafts of sunlight pierced the cracks of the cavern ceiling, illuminating patches of the stone floor, Zarya wandered further into the lair than she had dared before. She traced her fingers along the walls, noticing patterns and symbols that she had initially thought were mere decoration. The carvings were intricate, delicate, and unlike anything she had ever seen in the village. Flowers intertwined with geometric shapes, and runes etched in deep grooves seemed to tell stories in a language long forgotten. Her heart raced as she realized these symbols were not mere adornments. They were messages, warnings, and perhaps remnants of a history lost to time. Near a hidden alcove, she discovered a small collection of objects that seemed out of place amidst the cold stone and shadows. There were fragments of finely woven cloth, faded but elegant, and a small golden pendant, shaped like a crown, tarnished by age but unmistakably regal. She picked it up carefully, cradling it in her hands, and felt an inexplicable pull, a connection that resonated with the strange energy in the lair. Beneath the pendant lay a tattered scroll, edges frayed, written in the same cryptic script as the carvings. Zarya could not read the words, but the images depicted a man, handsome, noble, adorned in royal garments, and figures kneeling before him in reverence. The illustrations seemed to pulse with life, telling a story she had only glimpsed through fragmented symbols. Her mind raced as she connected the dots. The beast, the so-called monster, was not a creature born of malice or mindless rage. There were hints of nobility, intelligence, and power that defied the terrifying image the villagers had painted. Could it be possible that he had once been human? A prince, perhaps, whose life had been stolen by magic or betrayal. The thought both terrified and intrigued her. The air of authority that clung to him, the careful, deliberate movements she had noticed before, all began to make sense. He was not simply a beast. He was a being trapped in a form that concealed his true identity. Zarya spent hours exploring, her eyes scanning every surface for more clues. She found paintings of a grand castle, now in ruins, with banners fluttering in winds that no longer existed. There were symbols of alliances, shields emblazoned with unique crests, and depictions of ceremonies that suggested a kingdom that had once thrived. Among the relics she discovered small personal items, rings, a jeweled dagger, and fragments of letters that hinted at betrayal from those closest to him. The lair was not merely a prison, it was a sanctuary, a repository of memories, a record of a life that had been stolen. One evening, as the glow of the crystals cast shifting shadows across the cavern, Zarya dared to speak softly, almost reverently. "Who were you?" she whispered. The beast stirred, eyes narrowing, but instead of responding with menace, he approached slowly as if acknowledging her curiosity and respect. In that moment, Zarya felt the first true connection to the being she had feared. The clues she uncovered painted a picture of a prince, wronged by fate, cursed to endure life in a monstrous form. His lair was more than a dwelling, it was a chronicle of loss, resilience, and hope. Zarya's heart swelled with empathy. The creature before her was no mere legend to frighten the village. He was a living testament to the fragility of trust, the cruelty of betrayal, and the enduring strength of the human spirit hidden beneath layers of magic. By the end of the day, Zarya understood that the beast's story was intertwined with the Forgotten Kingdom, a tale erased from history but preserved in symbols, relics, and the silent dignity of his presence. And as she gazed upon him, she realized that the fear that had once consumed her might soon give way to a partnership forged in understanding, courage, and the shared discovery of truths long buried in the shadows of time. Over the following days, Zarya's initial fear of the beast began to soften, replaced by cautious observation and tentative curiosity. She noticed the subtle ways he interacted with the lair, the careful placement of objects, the gentle movements despite his immense size, and the small gestures that hinted at thoughtfulness rather than mere instinct. At first, she kept her distance, unwilling to provoke him or reveal her vulnerabilities. Yet, even in those careful moments, there were signs that he recognized her presence and, in his own way, respected it. One morning, Zarya awoke to find the lair illuminated by a faint, natural glow from a crystalline formation she had not noticed before. She had been worried the night had been cold and her modest blanket insufficient, yet she discovered that the beast had subtly adjusted her bedding, ensuring she was warmer than the cavern usually allowed. His movements had been quiet and deliberate, but the message was clear. He was aware of her comfort and had acted to preserve it. That simple act, almost imperceptible in its gentleness, stirred an unfamiliar feeling in Zarya, a spark of trust, a tiny seed that courage and curiosity could grow. Meals became moments of connection. Initially, Zarya had feared approaching him during feeding times, believing that even a single misstep could trigger his fury. But she noticed that he ate with a measured calm, never once making threatening gestures, and often paused to watch her, his gaze steady yet not predatory. Gradually, she began to speak softly during these times, narrating her thoughts, recounting memories from her village, or commenting on the strange beauty of the cavern. The beast would listen, tilting his head, his amber eyes following her every word. Occasionally he responded with a low rumble or a subtle movement that felt almost conversational. These small exchanges, fragile and tentative, began to build a bridge between them, crossing the chasm that fear had initially carved. Zarya also began noticing his protective instincts. When the cavern's wind swept fiercely through an unseen crevice, rattling stones and chilling the air, he would move closer, positioning himself between her and the draft. His massive form, once a source of terror, became a reassuring presence. She began to feel that she was not merely surviving alongside a creature of legend, but sharing a space with a being capable of awareness, empathy, and perhaps even loyalty. Conversations became slightly bolder. Zarya would speak of her dreams, her fears, and even the villagers' harsh judgment, and the beast would respond with subtle gestures. A tilt of the head, a step closer, a soft rumble of acknowledgement. With each interaction, her fear receded just a little, replaced by curiosity and the beginnings of genuine understanding. She saw intelligence behind his eyes, a mind that thought and weighed actions, and a heart, hidden beneath layers of fur and legend, that was capable of connection. By the end of the week, Zarya realized that the walls she had built around herself, fear, anger, and suspicion, were slowly dissolving. The beast was no longer just a terrifying figure of folklore. He was a companion, a guardian, and a partner in navigating the mysterious world of the lair. Trust was fragile like the glimmering crystal lights above, but it was there, growing steadily with each small act of kindness, each shared moment of quiet understanding. And in that fragile bond, Zarya discovered a new strength. The courage to face the unknown not as a prisoner, but as a willing participant in the unfolding story between herself and the being who had once haunted her nightmares. Back in the village, the absence of Zarya quickly became the spark that ignited fear and speculation. Whispers traveled faster than the wind, carrying fragmented stories from one hut to another, each retelling amplifying dread. Mothers clutched their children tightly, warning them to stay close to the fire, while elders huddled together, their faces pale with unease. "She has been taken by the beast," one villager muttered, voice trembling, or worse, transformed by its magic into something unnatural. The word spread like wildfire, growing in intensity and severity with each repetition. Panic settled over the village like a dense fog. No one dared venture near the forest's edge, fearing that even a glimpse of the shadows might invoke the beast's wrath. Children were forbidden from playing outside, and the marketplace, once lively with chatter and laughter, fell into uneasy silence. Every unexplained sound, a snapped branch, the rustle of leaves, the howl of distant wind, was taken as a sign that Zarya had been overtaken, that the beast's power had reached beyond the lair to touch the village itself. Superstition became the lens through which every event was interpreted, and reason was drowned in the tide of fear. The elders convened urgently, their faces etched with worry and anger. They debated the stories, each theory darker than the last. Perhaps Zarya had been bewitched or worse, corrupted into serving the beast willingly. "The girl is no longer herself," one elder claimed, shaking his head with certainty. "She walks with the creature in ways the eye cannot see. Its magic has claimed her body and soul." Others whispered that the lair's influence was spreading, that the forest itself was beginning to twist unnaturally, bending in response to her presence. Even those who had doubted the old tales now found themselves searching the trees with terror-stricken eyes, convinced that the forest was alive, conspiring with the beast. Fear bred superstition in unexpected ways. Some villagers claimed to see strange lights flickering at night near the edge of the trees, shapes shifting just beyond the vision of the untrained eye. Others swore they heard whispers calling Zarya's name in tones that chilled the bone. Wild theories took hold. The beast had marked her, granting her unnatural powers, or perhaps she had merged with it, becoming a hybrid neither human nor beast. These stories circulated quickly, feeding hysteria and prompting villagers to perform desperate rituals, leaving offerings at the forest's edge in hopes of appeasing whatever forces they imagined were at work. Even Zarya's family, who had once forced her into the lair, were consumed by dread and guilt. They spoke in hushed tones, blaming one another for the girl's fate, their voices trembling as they speculated whether she might return or if the forest had claimed her entirely. Anxiety permeated every household, infecting the village with collective unease. By the time night fell, the village was a place of shadowed suspicion, hearts heavy with fear. Every gust of wind, every rustle of leaves, and every distant howl was interpreted as proof that the beast and Zarya were no longer separate, that the unknown had reached into the village and unsettled the very foundation of their lives. Panic and superstition reigned, and the legend of the beast grew, entwined with the fate of Zarya, until no one could remember where fact ended and fear began. The revelation came on a night when the cavern was quieter than usual, the usual rustle of wind and water softened to a hushed stillness. Zarya had been sitting near the crystalline glow, contemplating the relics and symbols she had discovered, when the beast approached, not with the cautious restraint of before, but with a sense of urgency that made the air between them tremble. His amber eyes, usually calm and observing, now burned with intensity. He lowered his massive head to her level and for the first time his voice emerged, Not a growl, not a snarl, but a deep, resonant tone that carried both sorrow and strength. He spoke of a curse, ancient and cruel, woven by a sorcerer jealous of his kingdom and power. Long ago, before he became the beast, he had been a prince, heir to a flourishing kingdom, beloved by his people and respected by neighboring realms. But betrayal had struck from within. An envious magician had twisted his form into that of a monstrous creature, designed to evoke fear and sever ties with the human world he had known. The spell was potent, layered with magic that reacted to superstition, and it could not be broken by brute force or simple courage. Only an act of true understanding, empathy, and trust from a human heart could begin to unravel the layers of the enchantment. Zarya listened, heart pounding, as he explained that the curse affected more than his appearance. It had warped the forest, bent the lair to his torment, and magnified the villager's fear into a tangible force, isolating him from everything he had loved. Yet there was hope, slender but undeniable. If someone could see him beyond the monstrous exterior, if someone could recognize the person beneath, the prince could reclaim pieces of his former self. It was not a guarantee, but it was a beginning, a thread of possibility that depended entirely on trust, patience, and courage. Emotion swelled in Zarya as she absorbed the weight of the revelation. Every subtle gesture she had observed, the careful placement of objects, the deliberate gentleness, the quiet acknowledgement of her presence, now made sense. The amber eyes that had unsettled and intrigued her were not merely predatory but intelligent, calculating, and capable of loyalty. The stories she had grown up hearing, the legends that had painted him as a mindless monster, were a lie amplified by fear and superstition. Her own fear of him, so raw and immediate, had blinded her to the truth until now. She felt a strange mixture of awe, sorrow, and responsibility. Here was a being, trapped by forces far beyond his control, whose nobility and humanity had been erased in the eyes of the world. Her role, she realized, was no longer passive. She was not merely surviving alongside a feared creature. She was a potential agent in his redemption. Her empathy, her insight, and her courage could influence the course of magic itself. For the first time, Zarya did not shrink in fear but met his gaze steadily. "I see you," she whispered, voice trembling yet firm. The beast's eyes softened, the tension in his massive shoulders easing slightly. In that moment, the emotional stakes crystallized. The curse was more than a spell, it was a test of perception, of heart, of the willingness to look past appearances and embrace truth. And Zarya understood that the journey ahead would demand courage, patience, and perhaps a kind of love that transcended the physical, reaching into the very soul of the prince hidden within the beast. The days that followed the revelation of the beast's curse were filled with trials unlike any Zarya had imagined. Trust was not given freely. It had to be earned, demonstrated in actions, words, and choices that carried weight far beyond the ordinary. The beast, though calmer in her presence, remained cautious. His world had been shattered by betrayal and magic, and he could not allow himself to be vulnerable without proof that Zarya's intentions were genuine. Every gesture, every word, every interaction became a subtle test, a chance to measure courage, patience, and loyalty. The first challenge arose within the lair itself. Deep in one of the cavern's chambers, a sudden tremor shook the stone floor, sending loose rocks cascading like rain. A fissure opened near a crystalline formation, threatening to collapse entirely. Zarya froze for a heartbeat, heart hammering, before instinct propelled her forward. Without hesitation, she began moving debris, supporting stones with her hands, guiding the beast away from unstable areas. He observed quietly, amber eyes fixed on her movements, and when he assisted, careful but forceful, they worked together seamlessly, the unspoken communication between them forming the first tangible bond of trust. Another trial came from the forest outside. Strange, shadowed figures, creatures twisted by lingering magic, prowled the edges of the lair, drawn by the prince's presence. Zarya, unarmed and inexperienced in combat, had to rely on cleverness rather than strength. She studied the patterns of movement, suggested routes, and coordinated with the beast, who used his immense power to protect her while she guided him through the most vulnerable passages. Each successful evasion reinforced the trust between them. She relied on him, and he began to rely on her insights and courage in ways he had never done with anyone before. Emotional trials were subtler but no less significant. The beast tested her compassion, revealing moments of past pain, loss, and the lingering resentment he carried toward humanity. Zarya listened without judgment, responding with empathy rather than fear or pity. Her willingness to understand and respect his pain, rather than recoil from it, strengthened the bond between them in ways that brute actions could never achieve. She offered patience when his temper flared, reassurance when shadows of despair crossed his gaze, and quiet companionship when silence enveloped the cavern. Through these trials, Zarya discovered an unexpected resilience within herself. Courage was not only in facing physical danger but in facing the unknown, in standing firm when emotions swirled, and in choosing empathy over fear. The beast, in turn, began to reveal glimpses of his true self. Small smiles, protective gestures, and moments of vulnerability that had been buried beneath centuries of curse and suspicion. By the end of these tests, the partnership between them had transformed. What began as fear and hesitation evolved into mutual respect, understanding, and a deepening sense of loyalty. They had faced the chaos of the forest, the instability of the lair, and the emotional turbulence of past betrayals, emerging stronger each time. In these trials, Zarya and the beast discovered that courage, loyalty, and compassion were not abstract ideals but living forces, binding them together as allies, companions, and perhaps something even more profound, a shared hope that the curse could be broken, and that trust, once earned, could transform even the darkest of destinies. The climactic night arrived suddenly, as if the forest itself had sensed the culmination of trials and whispered secrets long hidden. The lair, normally calm under the glow of phosphorescent crystals, now pulsed with an unfamiliar energy. The air shimmered, a tension coiling tightly, pressing against Zarya's chest as she stood near the heart of the cavern. The beast had been restless all day, moving with a restrained urgency, eyes flicking toward her and then toward the cavern walls, as though sensing a threshold they were about to cross. Every instinct within her told her that something monumental was about to unfold, a moment that could either shatter or redeem everything they had endured. A sudden tremor rippled through the stone floor, vibrating through her bones. The crystals above flared in brilliant light, bathing the lair in hues of gold, blue, and violet that danced across the walls. The beast, larger than life and tense with energy, let out a deep, resonant growl that transformed into a sound she could no longer categorize, a note both mournful and triumphant, a vibration that seemed to reach into the very air and pulse through her heart. The ground beneath them seemed to shift, as though the lair itself responded to the spell woven into his being. Zarya stepped forward cautiously, heart racing, her voice trembling as she whispered, "It's okay. I see you." The transformation began subtly at first. A shiver ran through the beast's massive frame, fur rippling and shimmering with an otherworldly luminescence. The crystals overhead seemed to resonate in harmony, their glow intensifying and creating cascading reflections that fractured light into 1,000 sparkling shards. The beast's amber eyes, which had always held intelligence and restrained power, began to glow brighter, as though the light of his true self was fighting to emerge. Zarya watched in awe and fear as his enormous claws curled and softened, the fur retracting and receding like mist dissipating in the morning sun. A wave of magic surged through the cavern. The ground trembled, and the air grew thick with a luminous mist that swirled around the beast like a living cloak of energy. His form began to shrink, muscles and limbs reshaping, bone and sinew reforming into the proportions of a man. The crystalline light danced across his changing body, highlighting the contours of skin where fur had been, and the regal posture that slowly returned to his shoulders. His powerful jaw softened into the sharp yet noble lines of a prince's face, eyes still burning with amber intensity but now framed by human warmth and intelligence. Zarya gasped as his final form emerged. The prince, the same one depicted in the scrolls she had discovered, stood before her. He wore a tunic woven with intricate designs that seemed familiar, as though echoing the symbols she had studied in his lair. A pendant glimmered at his chest, the same crown-shaped charm she had once held in her hand, now resting as if it had been waiting for this exact moment. His hair, dark and streaked with silver light, framed a face that was at once commanding and gentle, filled with both centuries of suffering and the undeniable dignity of his lineage. For a heartbeat neither spoke. Zarya could only stare, tears pricking her eyes as the reality of the moment sank in. The beast, her fears, her trials, and her every night of solitude, was gone, replaced by the living, breathing prince she had glimpsed only in symbols, relics, and whispered stories. The air seemed lighter now, the oppressive weight of centuries of curse lifting in a wave of relief that echoed against the cavern walls. She reached out tentatively, unsure if the human hand before her could ever feel as real as the beastly presence had. When their fingers touched, warmth radiated through her, a bridge between the fear of the past and the hope of what had been restored. The prince spoke at last, his voice rich and resonant, carrying both gratitude and awe. You saw me when no one else could," he said, eyes glimmering with unshed emotion. You trusted me when the world would not, and that trust, that courage has freed me. Zarya felt a rush of emotion, tears flowing freely now, relief, wonder, and a profound joy that eclipsed even the deepest fear she had endured. She had not only survived the trials but had witnessed the impossible, the restoration of a soul trapped by deceit and magic, the reclaiming of identity from the shadows of legend. As the last remnants of the transformation faded, the lair itself seemed to exhale, the crystals dimming to a gentle glow, the shadows retreating to their proper places, and the air clearing of the heavy, electric tension that had gripped it. The prince stood fully formed, regal and human, yet with an aura of power and wisdom that spoke of centuries spent surviving a monstrous existence. Zarya realized that the trials, the fear, and even the terror had been necessary, not just for him but for her. She had proven herself, and in doing so she had forged a bond strong enough to shatter a centuries-old curse. Emotions surged in her heart, awe at his restored form, pride in her own courage, relief at the lifting of the curse, and a budding tenderness for the man who had endured so much. The prince, no longer hidden behind the guise of fear, extended his hand to her, and she took it without hesitation. In that touch, the lingering shadows of dread were replaced with light and promise, and the lair, once a prison, felt like the threshold of a new beginning, a place where trust, courage, and compassion had rewritten destiny itself. In the glow of the crystalline light, Zarya realized the magnitude of what had occurred. She had witnessed transformation, not just of form but of the heart and soul. The beast was gone, but the prince, noble and restored, now stood before her, and together they faced a world full of possibilities, forged from trials, empathy, and the enduring strength of human connection.